People who work in the ER, what's the scariest, dumbest, weirdest thing someone has come in for? Here's a few. Had a lady come in for shortness of breath, began to place an oxygen mask on her. She then yells, "I'm allergic to oxygen," and then pulls the mask off. I heard another doctor laugh behind the curtain. A morbidly obese guy came in for right lower quadrant pain. I lifted up his stomach and found his lost wallet. Solved two problems. A chick comes in because she said she had a miscarriage, says that in the last 2 years since she got on birth control to help regulate her periods, she'd had a miscarriage every month. We've had to explain to her that she was experiencing regular periods. So this big white lady comes in with this massive bruise around her lower stomach area. I asked what happened and she responds, my horse kicked me in my lady bits. And I just spit my lip and turned around to force myself to not immediately bust out laughing. A 35-year-old male, chief complaint, boogers have started to taste bad for 1 week. A 20-year-old male comes in for stomach pains, says he was hungry and hadn't eaten in 2 days. So that last one, he got fed hospital food and was never ever hungry again, I bet. Story 2. I live in Arizona and years ago my kid crashed a scooter and ended up in the emergency room with a broken wrist. Boring, I know, but not the kid they brought into the curtain next door 10 minutes later. We dubbed him Cactus Boy. The poor kid took an off-balance tumble into a major cactus patch and had literally thousands of spines in him, head to toe. Side of his head, down his body on the same side, and all down his leg. Like a horror movie special effect, but all too real. Needless to say, our run-of-the-mill injury got properly pushed down the priority list as all hands concentrated on Cactus Boy. They quickly gave him a serious shot of something, maybe Demerol, so he was pretty calm after the medicine took effect and they cut his clothes off. Huge relief when the optical team confirmed his eye wasn't involved. We could see little flashes of the treatment as the med team entered and exited through the curtain. From what we could make out, it took about an hour of careful hemostat work to remove the big spines, one by one. Then they started carefully pouring what looked like household white glue on areas, let it harden, and then peeled it off to remove the finer needles. Still makes me shiver to remember the way that poor kid looked at his parents. The hospital admitting folks and the medical staff brought him into the area covered with those thousands of cactus needles. Yikes. Story 3. My mom used to be a registrar in an ER, so when patients came in, she was the one who took their insurance, asked about their symptoms, took their vitals, etc. One day, she's entering paperwork for a woman whom I think came in for injuries to her hands, but I don't quite remember. So mom's taken her information, and one of the questions is about the patient's occupation. The woman says, I work for Dinty Moore. Mom responded that she had no idea Dinty Moore hired that particular role. The woman says, no, I'm a and gestures emphatically in the air with her hands all red. Turns out she strips the meat off of cow tails. That's apparently what the meat is in Dinty Moore beef stew, cow tail. Story 4. I used to be an EMT, and one time we got called to a house in the middle of the night for a patient with belly pain. So we get to his house, and he is bent over a chair in extreme pain. We get him in the ambulance and start taking him to the ER. The whole drive, he's letting out these tiny farts that are pretty deadly. He's also yelling that he just needs to fart. Can we give him something to make him fart? The ER doc asks us if there is a possibility of a foreign body tissue, and I say that I didn't check. Doctor sends him to the CT scanner where he lets rip with a fart that echoes. He felt better and left the ER. They had to close the scanner to air it out. So he just called 911 just to fart? Story 5. My mother-in-law is a victims advocate in a crime-ridden area of Colorado. She doesn't necessarily treat anyone, but she does see crime scenes firsthand as well as other interactions with victims and survivors. She has 2 stories that stick out in my mind. The first story was a report she read. She wasn't on call that night, but she had the opportunity to read the case report the day after. Apparently, a woman was threatening to end her life with a chef's knife. She was surrounded by 5 cops who called her bluff. She wasn't bluffing and proceeded to fight off all 5 of the officers. She was eventually taken to the hospital and lived. The next one is even crazier. My mother-in-law was on call and responded to an accident. A guy tried to take his life by running his truck into a wall. He tried to bail out of his window at the last second, but couldn't because he was wearing a seatbelt. So his torso started to make it out of the vehicle and his arms were taken away by a stop sign. It was my mother-in-law's job to contact and offer her services to his wife, so she called the man's wife immediately. The wife was informed of the accident and was told her husband was in the hospital. Her response was apathetic, to say the least, and said she'd think about going to the hospital with my mother in law after she took a nap. Mother in law thought this was odd, but went with it anyway. The wife shows up at the hospital later and pulls her husband off life support, and he passed away that day. It turns out he did that to himself because his wife was leaving him. She was leaving him because he was physically cruel. So sometimes I think about the cops finding his arms and hitting him in the face and saying, "Stop hitting yourself! Stop hitting yourself!" Story 6. Not a doctor, but the patient. When I injured my shoulder, I thought it was pretty bad, but the NHS telephone service were adamant that it was a muscle injury. And as it was Christmas, my GP surgery was shut, so I just sucked it up, put on ice packs, and got on with it until the day after Boxing Day when the pain got so bad I basically lost the use of the arm entirely. 48 hours later, driven half demented by the pain, I turned up at accident and emergency and told them I'd hurt my shoulder. The triage nurse came in, looked at me funny, then told me to get on a stretcher. I did so, and they took me for an x-ray, then took me through to the ward. I could tell when they were talking about me because they referred to me as the fireman, and there was a number of muffled conversations going on along the lines of mumble mumble, shoulder, mumble mumble, fireman, mumble, mumble mumble, mumble mumble. How long? Shh, mumble mumble. Apparently, I'd been walking around with my arm dislodged for about a week. They were surprised I'd managed to make it beyond 24 hours without coming to the hospital. Once they put it back in, they found out the joint had developed a great big calcium deposit, so there was a huge needle filled with hydrocortisone. Even with the morphine and Entonox, the pain was bad enough that I barely managed to keep my lunch down. So the moral of the story is, if you get hurt, get that crap checked out. Story 7. X-ray tech here did a chest X-ray on a male in the ICU with severe pneumonia. He was barely able to get a breath. On an X-ray, his lungs were completely white. White means dense, hard material like bone or metal, and lungs are a mixture of black, air, and gray, tissue and mucus. It was weird with a complete whiteness, and I wondered what kind of material it is or what happened to his lungs, so I called the doc for a medical history. The doc replied thusly: patient was on a bender looking for illegal substances. He broke into his neighbor's garage and found a batch of powder in his neighbor's fishing tackle box and snorted the whole thing. A few days later, he develops pneumonia. It turns out that the fisherman's neighbor's sister had passed away years ago, and the fisherman kept her ashes in his tackle box, so she went with him whenever he went fishing, just like when she was alive. The patient had snorted the leftover metallic ash of his neighbor's late sister. He passed a week later. The other one I remember most was a man who had been involved in a motorcycle accident, severe road rash over nearly his entire body. He said he slid about 200 feet, but broke no bones and had no internal injuries. We had to cut his shredded clothes off of him to do x-rays of each of his limbs and chest and back, and manipulating a man's body for x-rays when he's screaming the entire time just haunted me for an equally long time. The worst part of it was I came back in to check on him after his results came back. No broken bones, amazingly. And he was lying on the bed and holding his arms in the air, and they were trembling with all of his strength to keep them held up because it just hurt so badly to rest them on the bed sheets. He was weeping softly with the effort, and honestly though, he was lucky in the bigger scheme of things. He could have passed away or been severely paralyzed. So that last one got to me, and I really hope he made it through. And since you're halfway through the video, please do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. Now let's go ahead and get back to these insane stories. Story 8. Weirdest, an elderly couple were found outside their cars on the side of the road outside of town. They were on their way back to their home province when they somehow ended up separated from the car and from each other. Both had exposure with no memory of how they got there. They also begged us not to contact any family members. They were fine in the end, but the whole thing was just kind of strange. Scariest, a woman with schizophrenia was occasionally brought in by the police because the voices were telling her to end her parents and her neighbors. Apparently, the voices started telling her to end the people in the ER as well. Dumbest, a parent was convinced their child had internal bleeding because she ate an entire pint of blueberries, which caused her poop to turn a bluish color. Her discharge diagnosis was literally ate a carton of blueberries. Also, don't ever try to put that Veet depilatory cream near your lady bits. Just don't do it ever. Story 9. My dad worked in the ER as a doc when I was a kid. He was single, so I got to go a few days a week. I have a couple of crazy stories. Most incredible, a lady and her husband are driving down the highway. A big bolt falls off the back of a truck, bounces, and goes through their window. She slams on the brakes, stops, and they start to look and survey the damage. Husband looks at the wife, and the bolt has gone right into her eye. For whatever reason, the doctors knew she'd pass away if they took the bolt out, so they had her husband say goodbye and had to eventually pull it out. Funny, an old lady living out in the country was really constipated. When you get old, apparently, taking a dump is a big deal sometimes, and this lady just couldn't go. And it gets so bad that she goes outside behind her shed, gets a stick, and proceeds to try to dig it out of herself. Well, older folks also don't have good balance. So as she's trying to dig out the dirt, she falls over on the stick, and the rest is obvious. Dad had to remove the stick. Serious bad luck. A guy is trimming a tree in the front yard, and for safety, he ties a rope to a high limb in the tree and the other end of the rope around his waist. He's got his truck parked next to the tree like he usually does. So he goes up his ladder to start cutting, loses his balance, and falls. As he's falling, the rope catches him, flips him upside down, and swings him towards the truck. Now, what the man didn't realize is that he had parked his truck too close to the tree, and his wife finds him already gone. Story 10. I worked in ER billing, not the ER, and this story actually makes me angry as hell, but had a kid's chart with codes for nausea, vomiting, and a broken rib. So I, being Snoopy and having time to waste, opened up the nurse's notes instead of just entering the info. Turns out the kid swallowed his toothpaste after brushing instead of spitting it out. So Mom of the Year freaked the heck out and gave the kid the Heimlich, then that's how he got his rib broken. Honorable mention to the lady who came in with her workers' comp insurance info ready to go for a laceration, which is pretty common, but in the section for laceration repair, the nurse had angrily scribbled through dermabond and sutures and whatnot to handwrite tiny band-aid in the box. So yeah, this lady went to the ER and wasted a whole bunch of people's time for a paper cut. Story 11. I'm a phlebotomist, so I draw blood from everybody that walks through the ER. I've seen so much that I basically just tune out the weirdness. I'm there for a job, and the sooner I get my blood, the faster I can move on to other tasks. Scariest, a guy comes in coding after being found passed out at the kitchen table. They couldn't get an E-tube in him, but CPR otherwise was going okay. They discover that there is an entire hot dog down his throat, blocking his trachea. The RT ends up pulling out a 6-inch long by a 1-inch wide hot dog. And I haven't eaten a hot dog since then because I'm terrified of choking to death. The dumbest, a 19-year-old kid just finished 9 months of chemo for cancer. He decides to celebrate by getting wasted, passed out in an elevator at 3 a.m., and wasn't found for a couple of hours. Not quite sure whatever happened to him, but it was stupid of him to get buzzed after getting chemo the same day. The dumbest, the second one, a girl was 100% convinced she was pregnant. Her period was a day late, she felt fluttering in her belly, and had nausea. Well, her serum pregnancy came back negative, and she insisted we do a HCG level because it was too early. Doctor ordered it anyway, dumb, and was less than 5, aka negative. PT was still convinced that our hundreds of thousands of dollars in machinery was inaccurate and demanded an ultrasound. Found lots and lots of gas, but no baby. We wasted around $500 on her stupidity because her government insurance refused to pay for the HCG and US, and she would never pay it, so we absorbed the cost. Story 12. Dumbest, guy had gastro, thought it was a good idea to spew out the window of the car he was driving at 110 kilometers per hour, rolled the car several times and survived without a scratch. Idiot. Scariest, chiropractor quote-unquote adjusted the neck of a guy who had myeloma and fractured his C1 vertebrae. Funniest, a guy gets jabbed in the chest with a fork by his angry girlfriend, 4 beautiful puncture wounds on his upper chest, and pneumothorax ensues. Annoying, took 1 sleeping tablet, cannot sleep. Story 13. Happened to my boyfriend. He was out drinking with friends, and between the 3 of them, they somehow consumed 2 Texas Mickeys. I don't know how that's humanly possible, but I digress. Anyways, they're messing around, being buzzed idiots, and get into the compound for an RV sales company when one of the friends dares my boyfriend to climb onto a camper bus like the ones used for tour buses and jump off of it onto the pavement. He takes the dare, lands, and instantly has shooting pains up his legs and feet, collapses onto the pavement, and they make it out of the compound and call a taxi to the ER. Turns out he shattered his ankle so horrendously that they had to put him into hours of surgery to basically repair all nerves and veins, remove copious amounts of debris, and basically rebuild his entire ankle and foot. Luckily, the left foot had minor fractures. Now he's got a disgusting scar and had to spend almost a year in the hospital dealing with many complications in the rebuilt foot. And 10 years later, he is able to walk on it, but jumping and running are beyond out of the question. If he breaks what's left of that ankle, it's pretty much going to have to be amputated. He has a lot of nerve problems in that foot, and even the slightest tickle or anything apparently feels like someone is jabbing needles all through his right leg and foot. I guess we can say that the moral of the story is to always pick truth instead of dare. Story 14. First, a girl in her early 20s came in because she had popcorn stuck in her teeth. Second, had a woman come in saying she was in labor, was rushed off to I&D where they determined she was not in fact pregnant. She told them that she was indeed 36 months pregnant, but the baby was just not yet ready. They sent her back down for a psych consult. Third, had some EMTs drop off an older patient and they just said, "Hey, he might need your help." So I walked into the room and the guy looked up at me and coded. I solely CPR for over an hour while the nurses and docs pushed meds. And just as they were about to call it, the patient grabbed my arm and sat straight up. He survived to discharge. Fourth, I also had this guy who was coding, and he was fully awake while we were doing compressions, grabbing our arms and fighting us off, because we were perusing his brain. The second we would stop for the bag or do a rhythm check, he was asystole, and every single time, he ended up not making it. Story 15. I was working one afternoon, say around 3 p.m.ish, when a frequent flyer came in ETOH, buzzed, for medical clearance for police detention. His BAC was .58, I kid you not. I was blown away, and several nurses were pretty impressed too. Then the doctor proceeded to inform me that .58 was not even the highest that this patient had ever had in our ER. I'd never even considered those numbers to be even humanly possible. I suppose he had hit the stage of being so hammered that he's no longer hammered, he just transcended into a whole new plane of existence. I hope you enjoyed the video and all the stories that we shared with you today, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you're also going to enjoy the next one. Doctors, what made you say, "How are you still alive?" Story number 5 in that video is mind-blowing. I'll see you there, and thank you for watching this one.